It's not often in PC building that there's a singular product that's just so dominant that it just doesn't make any sense to recommend much else. But today's video sponsor, AMD, has had just that when it comes to the obvious choice for gaming CPUs. Not for just this generation, but the last several. We got the opportunity to get the AMD Ryzen 7 9800X3D built up into a killer gaming system and see just how well it will perform, especially in some brand spanking new gaming titles. So again, big thanks to AMD for sponsoring this build and this video, and now let's jump into it. One of the things I've always liked to do when it comes to these types of builds is to make sure they're beefy enough to be our flagship giveaway prize over on our Twitch stream. And since I'm trying to do the 9800X3D CPU justice, that's exactly what we pieced together here. We'll talk about the star of the show CPU in a bit, but the supporting cast has a lot to offer as well. The case we're dropping the whole thing into is the Geometric Future Model 5 vent, a simple dual chamber setup that keeps things open and clean, but also with a splash of color. The orange accents really just add a subtle element that isn't too over the top. Ours came with 5 included fans, 4 reverse fans for intake on the bottom and side with a rear exhaust to give us decent airflow. And it can fit all the big boy graphics cards up to 430 millimeters in length and even supports them going vertical, but I still opted for the normal horizontal placement. For the living quarters of the Ryzen CPU, we have the ASRock Phantom Gaming X870 Nova Wi-Fi. We get all the latest necessities on this motherboard. Wi-Fi 7 and Bluetooth 5.4 are here for your wireless connections, and wired connections are also aplenty here. The AMD X870 chipset and its bigger brother, the X870E, provide USB 4 as standard, and you'll find 2 of those 40 gigabit per second ports in the back of the Nova. Then you're greeted with significantly more USB-A ports, 2 USB 3.2 Gen 2 ports, 3 USB 3.2 Gen 1 ports, and then 4 USB 2.0 ports. And in case you weren't counting along at home, that's 11 total USB ports included with the board, with plenty more being supported via the front panel connectors. Also, can't forget the 5 gigabit Ethernet port for giving you quick internets, and the included HDMI port to take advantage of the integrated graphics that are on the Ryzen 7 CPU. Dropped into 2 of the 4 RAM slots on the board, we have a 96 gigabyte kit of Corsair Dominator Titanium DDR5 RAM. The Nova Mambo itself can clock up to 8200 megatransfers with the Expo settings, but we kept it a bit more chill with this kit being rated for up to 6600 megatransfers. For storage, taking advantage of the X870 chipset from AMD, we went with the new Samsung 9100 Pro Gen 5 SSD. 2 terabytes of capacity at up to 14,800 megabytes per second of read speed. It's highly overkill for gaming for most people, but the chipset supports it, so we went for it. Powering the whole PC is the ASRock Steel Legend 1200 watt power supply, 80 plus gold, cybernetics platinum, fully modular ATX 3.1 compatibility, and PCIe 5.1 ready. It's got all the juice needed for the CPU and graphics card. And what's cooling the 9800X3D is the Asus ROG Rio 3 360 ARGB. Honestly, a bit overkill to use this beefy of a cooler on such an efficient gaming chip. We'll go over the specific temps in a bit, but we're looking at a default TDP of 120 watts on the 9800X3D, which is no issue for the Rio, which features a copper CPU plate, 8th gen Asetek pump, and 3 fans capable of 70 CFM of airflow. The Anime Matrix LED is pretty neat and a bit of a different look from traditional LCD screens that have become a popular trend on high-end coolers in recent years. And to really flex the muscles of the 8-core, 16-thread, 96 megabytes of L3 cache, up to 5.2 gigahertz clock speed CPU monster, we're plugging in the RTX 5090 Founders Edition to really unlock the full potential of the processor. And to be honest, based on some tests of the professional version of this card, the Ryzen 7 9800X3D still has room to stretch for a few more faster generations of graphical processors. So now that we've gotten the pleasantries of introductions out of the way with this system that we'll name Reggie, it's time for Yins to rate the cable management here. Kyler did his best, especially with the limited time I gave him and the slimmer back chamber of the Geometric Future case. Drop a rating out of 10 down below of his skills, 10 being super meticulous and a 1 being the equivalent of a pigeon nest, just super gross. And if you won't do it, ask your dad. He'll know what's up. He'll do the rating for you. And while you're doing that, let's showcase some numbers on this system. So in the brand new title Hell Is Us, we decided to test out the 9800X3D plus its GPU and a few different settings just to see where can the 9800X3D go from here. So we started out at 4K, highest settings with no frame generation or super resolution. And that gave us 95 FPS average with a 69.01% low. A super performance setup on one of the latest titles out there, but one of the things to note is that the CPU only pulled 61 watts of power, meaning it still has plenty of leg room left to go in terms of its performance. And that cooler kept it down to 43 degrees Celsius because again, it really didn't have to work very hard to hit that 95 FPS average. And in a lot of games, what you'll see is that the CPU has to work harder the lower the resolution is because you tend to be more CPU bottlenecked at that setting. So we decided to test that out here, dropping it down to 1080p Ultra, which did indeed increase our FPS up to 162.2 average and increase the power consumption of the 9800X3D up to 72 watts. Again, staying super cool at 45C, barely hotter than a human body, but it did show that there is more performance to be gained from the 9800X3D. Then we dropped the settings to low just to see where we could go from there. That increased the FPS up to 260 for the average and the power consumption to 77 watts, barely increasing the temperature, but showed that again, yes, you can get more performance out of the 9800X3D even here. And then we dropped it to 720p low and we saw that 276.7 FPS average was what we got. So at 1080p low and 720p low, you can get over a quarter of 1,000 FPS out of the 9800X3D in a brand new game. Now let's take a look at another brand new game, Mafia: The Old Country. We did a very similar test, starting out with 4K highest settings, dropping it to 1080p, then dropping the settings, then dropping it down to 720p. What we saw was a very similar trend. At 4K epic with no frame generation, we saw a 62 FPS average with only 53 watts power consumption and a 42 degrees Celsius temperature. Dropping it to 1080p but keeping the same settings doubled the FPS to be at 124.4, but only increased the power consumption 15 watts, barely anything, and only increased the temperature to 48 degrees Celsius. Dropping all those settings to low, we managed to pull another 6 watts, but squeeze out roughly another 70 FPS at 193.6. And then dropping the resolution to 720p low, we pulled another 4 watts to hit 78 and increased the FPS up to 218.1 average. Again, just showing that the 9800X3D can keep going and still had even more room from here. Now let's take a look at the latest Call of Duty game. There's some intriguing details in here to show that it's actually kind of well optimized in a way that very few other games are. It actually had the 9800X3D working the hardest at its 4K highest settings versus going down to 1080p. We saw our highest pull on the 9800X3D with 108 watts. Again, staying super cool with 63 degrees Celsius, but we managed to pull 174 FPS average at that 4K extreme setting with no frame generation. But when we dropped the resolution down to 1080p, keeping the same extreme settings, we saw that the power consumption on the 9800X3D went down to 86 watts. So the developers of the latest Call of Duty have done something to make it so that when you increase the resolution, the CPU has to work harder, but didn't seem to be a problem for the 9800X3D. But at 1080p extreme, with that 53 degrees Celsius temperature, we managed to average 256 FPS. Again, just a phenomenal showing for this CPU. At the lowest settings at 1080p, we bumped that up to 364 FPS average, pulling 92 watts, and then dropping it down to 720p, we hit 373 FPS average, showing that the 9800X3D can be an impeccable esports CPU, especially when paired with a fast enough graphics card. Now, just a couple notes on all of this testing. Hell Is Us and Mafia: The Old Country are two brand new games and they ran surprisingly smoothly. There's been a lot of controversy in the news lately about certain modern games that have been dropping that have not necessarily been consistent or well optimized. That is not the case here. 1% lows were remarkably good, which means that there's very little frame rate variation. The average FPS and the 1% lows are very close together, meaning that the experience you get is gonna stay consistent and not be jumping around all of the time. As you can see, the Ryzen 7 9800X3D is a CPU that's capable of delivering some seriously high frame rates when the games are optimized for it. And it still has a lot of wiggle room left for years to come for faster graphics cards. Temps are also super manageable, with again a 360mm AIO being ridiculously overkill in this situation. AMD's created something that honestly is just like its predecessor, the Ryzen 7 7800X3D. It's a gaming CPU that's so far ahead of its time in terms of performance and efficiency that once you get it, you'll only have to look at upgrading other areas of your PC, not your CPU. Kinda think of it like your case. You just kind of keep that and then everything else upgrades. That's what the 9800X3D provides for you here. And obviously I can't speak to how long the processor will last you, but the Ryzen 7 9800X3D seems like a sure bet for years to come. And again, big thanks to AMD for sponsoring this video. You can check out the 9800X3D at the link in the description below, and you can pick all of this up on Newegg and get a free gift with AMD. You've got bundles like the Ryzen 9 7900X with a free MSI cooler, or the Ryzen 5 9600X with some free RAM. The current AMD bundle offers end September 27th, but more free bundle deals will be coming in October.